The sound of the train wheels was a mournful, rhythmic clatter, a sound that, to Captain Elias Vance, had become the only steady beat in a life unmoored by war. He stared out the grime-streaked window as the Pennsylvania landscape blurred into shades of late autumn ochre and somber green. It had been 4 years since he'd seen these familiar fields, 4 years since he'd traded the quiet certainty of his family's mill in Lancaster County for the absolute, terrifying chaos of the Army of the Potomac. He was going home, but the Elias Vance who boarded this train was not the same young man who had left. The war had ended 5 months ago, in April of 1865. Lincoln was dead, Richmond was in ashes, and the nation was struggling to stitch itself back together. Elias had survived Antietam, Fredericksburg, and the relentless, grinding horror of the wilderness. But it was the 3 days in July of 1863, the brutal symphony played out across the fields and ridges of Gettysburg, that truly claimed him. He felt the weight of it now, not just in his soul, but in the stiff, unnatural way he held his left arm, a legacy of a bullet that had shattered bone and his illusion of invincibility. His hand went to the pocket of his worn olive-drab uniform coat, touching the smooth, cold surface of the object he carried. It wasn't a medal, nor a letter from home. It was a simple, tarnished brass locket, found clutched in the hand of a fallen man at the base of Little Round Top. A Confederate soldier, barely a boy, whose eyes had held a mixture of terror and resignation that Elias would never forget. He hadn't been able to leave it. It felt like an anchor to a moment he couldn't afford to forget, or maybe a responsibility he couldn't put down. The train slowed, the whistle blowing a long, lonesome cry that echoed the emptiness inside him. He was in Lancaster. Stepping onto the platform, the air hit him, a blend of wet coal smoke, cut timber, and the distinctive scent of the rich, dark Pennsylvania soil. It was the smell of home, yet it felt alien. The town was alive, bustling with a fragile, almost hysterical energy of recovery. People laughed too loudly, their movements too quick, as if trying to outrun the shadow of the recent past. A familiar figure stood waiting by an aging horse and cart. Josiah, the grizzled foreman of the Vance family mill, his face a road map of worry lines, now creased with a tentative, hopeful smile. "Captain Vance, welcome home, son. Your father, he's beside himself with relief," Josiah said, his voice thick with emotion, as he took Elias's good hand in a firm, calloused grip. "Josiah, it's good to see a friendly face," Elias managed, his voice rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken much on the journey. He had been listening instead. He had been listening for her. The haunting had begun not on the fields of Gettysburg, but 2 weeks after the battle, while recovering in a field hospital. It was a sound first, a crystalline, sorrowful soprano voice, too near and too clear to be real, singing a hymn he couldn't quite place. Then the whisper, a name, his name, breathed against his ear in the dead of night, followed by a rush of cold air that raised goosebumps on his feverish skin. Now, even here, in the heart of his hometown, he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible shushing sound, like silk brushing stone. Josiah loaded the meager trunk onto the cart. As they drove through the familiar streets, Elias noticed the subtle scars of war, a missing window pane here, a faded Union flag there, a woman in deep mourning, black, on a porch swing. They reached the Vance estate, a grand old stone house nestled beside the rushing waters of the Conestoga River, where the family mill stood, a monument to generations of hard work.
His father, Arthur Vance, a man of stern principle and quiet strength, met him at the door. He was grayer, thinner, but his eyes, the same piercing blue as Elias's, were alight with genuine joy. The reunion was tender, yet strained. There were no grand declarations, only tight embraces and the unspoken acknowledgement of the gulf between them. Elias's mother, Mary, wept silently, her hands tracing the lines of suffering on his face. That evening, the silence of the house was punctuated only by the crackle of the hearth fire. Elias sat alone in his old study, surrounded by the books he once loved. He tried to read Walden, but the words felt hollow. He needed to face the haunting. It was a presence, a cold spot in the room, a disturbance in the air. He pulled the brass locket from his pocket and placed it on the mahogany desk. It was an oval shape, intricately engraved with a single blooming rose. "Show yourself," he said, his voice low, a challenge to the unseen. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. The flame of the oil lamp flickered violently, though the windows were tightly shut. A scent, sweet and cloying like wilting lilies, filled the air. And then he saw her. She materialized slowly, like smoke resolving into form, standing beside the bookshelf. She was a woman of ethereal, haunting beauty, dressed in a simple gray linen dress that looked like it was woven from moonlight. Her hair, the color of midnight, tumbled unbound around shoulders that seemed too fragile to hold the weight of the world. But it was her eyes that held him captive, large, luminous, and filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow. They were the color of the granite rocks on Little Round Top. She was utterly, perfectly silent. Elias had faced down Confederate artillery at point-blank range, but this spectral presence was the only thing that had ever truly paralyzed him with fear and, strangely, a profound, aching pity. "Who are you?" he whispered. Her lips didn't move, yet a sound, a thought echoed in the chamber of his mind, cold and clear as a winter bell. "The locket. You must finish it. Back to the stones, to the field." The words were not English, but pure meaning hammered directly into his consciousness. "Finish what? What is in the locket?" he demanded, his hand reaching for the object. She took a single, slow, deliberate step toward the desk, her expression twisting into one of desperate urgency. Her translucent fingers floated over the surface of the locket.
Gettysburg. He waits. As suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The room returned to its normal temperature, the lamp flame steadied, and the scent of lilies evaporated, replaced by the mundane smell of dust and old paper. Elias stared at the locket. He knew what he had to do. The war hadn't released him. This spirit, this beautiful, terrifying specter from the most hallowed ground of the conflict, was demanding he return to the place where his soul had been broken. He opened the locket. Inside, there was no photo, only a meticulously folded, yellowed slip of paper. He unfolded it carefully. In delicate, cursive script, only 2 words were written. The sycamore. Elias Vance knew of only one sycamore significant enough to be an answer to a ghost's demand. It was the massive, ancient sycamore tree standing sentinel near the peach orchard in Gettysburg, where some of the most brutal and confused fighting of the second day had taken place. He was going back to Gettysburg, not as a soldier, but as a deliverer for a lost, desperate soul. He had survived the war, but the truth of the war and the truth of this spirit was still buried under the Pennsylvania dirt, and he had to dig it up.
Elias barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the sorrowful, luminous eyes of the ghost. He left a terse note for his parents, an unresolved regimental business in Harrisonburg, and was gone before dawn. He took the morning stagecoach west, the journey back to Gettysburg, a jarring reversal of his homecoming. The landscape grew starker, the rolling hills giving way to the jagged, imposing terrain that had once been the backdrop for hell itself. The other passengers, a traveling salesman, a dour farmer, and an elderly woman knitting furiously, chattered about reconstruction taxes and the price of grain. Elias heard none of it, his mind already marching back over those bloody fields. The brass locket felt heavy in his coat pocket, a warm spot against the cold air, a physical link to the terror he was seeking. The two words inside, the sycamore, had lodged themselves in his memory. He arrived in the town of Gettysburg itself late that afternoon. It was a place struggling to reclaim normalcy. The scars were everywhere, patched walls, makeshift fences, and the deep, unsettling quiet that had replaced the thunder of cannons. But the townspeople were already adapting. Taverns were reopening, businesses were taking in tourists, morbidly curious visitors who wanted to walk the ground where the nation's fate had been decided. Elias checked into a modest boarding house on Baltimore Street. He didn't want the grandeur of a hotel. He wanted anonymity. He needed to be invisible to the living while attempting to be visible to the dead. That evening he ventured out to a local eatery. He ordered stew and attempted to eat, but the food tasted like ash. Instead, he listened. He listened to the murmurs of the men around him, former soldiers, townsmen who had hidden in their cellars, and a few scavengers trying to make a quick profit from leftover ordnance. He eventually steered the conversation toward the battle, and specifically the peach orchard, the area the ghost had indicated. "Any strange things happen out near the Shurfy farm, near that big old sycamore?" Elias asked a man nursing a mug of cider, a local whose eyes held the haunted look common to anyone who had seen the battle up close. The man, whose name was Silas, paused, his brow furrowing. "Strange? Captain, the whole damn battlefield is strange. The air still smells like ozone and regret out there. But the sycamore, yeah, folks talk. They say you hear things when the sun goes down, whispers, and sometimes they say you see lights." "Lights?" Elias pressed. Silas leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Like a lantern, but not quite, moving low, slow, mostly down by the wall where Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade hit. They say it's a woman looking for something, or someone." Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. The ghost was known, and she was connected to a Confederate unit. The locket was found clutched by a Confederate boy. The pieces were starting to align. Chapter 3. The Sentinel Tree. The next morning, Elias rented a sturdy mare and rode south out of town, following the familiar route toward the heart of the battlefield. The monuments were already beginning to appear, simple stone markers hastily erected, paying homage to the fallen. He rode past the rolling expanse of the wheat field, a place of unspeakable carnage, now peaceful and still. He passed the Sickles Angle, where General Sickles had disastrously advanced his corps. Finally, he arrived at the intersection of roads that formed the peach orchard. The sycamore was magnificent, a truly colossal tree that had stood on this ground for generations, its wide, gnarled limbs reaching out like a silent, sorrowful witness. Its bark was scarred, not just from time, but from the shrapnel and bullets of the battle, proof that even nature could not escape the conflict. Elias dismounted and tethered his horse to a fence post. The sun was high, but the area felt heavy, saturated with sorrow. He pulled the brass locket from his pocket and held it out so the faint message inside was visible.
"I'm here," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. "Show me." Nothing. The air was calm, the sun warm. The ghost of Lancaster was silent here. Perhaps she only manifested in the confines of her trauma, or perhaps she needed the cover of darkness. Elias spent the entire day meticulously searching the area around the sycamore. He walked the perimeter of the low stone wall that ran along the property line, the very wall where Silas had mentioned the spectral lights. He was looking for any anomaly, any sign that someone had hidden something or dug something up. It was late in the afternoon, the long shadows stretching out across the field, when he found it. Beneath a massive root of the sycamore, where the dirt had been slightly eroded by rain, a faint indentation was visible. He knelt down, using his knife to gently scrape away the loose soil. It wasn't a grave, but a small, shallow depression, almost perfectly square. He dug with his hands, his fingers quickly hitting something hard. He pulled it out, a small, dark cedar box, no larger than a cigar box. It was weathered and slightly warped, but the latch was still intact. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a faded piece of crimson velvet, lay two items. The first was a miniature portrait painted on ivory. It was a beautiful, clear rendering of a young woman, the same woman as the ghost, though here she was vibrant, alive, and smiling. Her midnight hair was pulled up, and her luminous eyes sparkled with mischievous joy. The second item was a folded, thin sheaf of letters bound by a piece of blue ribbon that had once been bright, but was now nearly black with decay. Elias's hands trembled as he touched the portrait, feeling the chill of the cedar box. He had found the Confederate soldier's secret, the reason he had died clutching the locket, a final desperate connection to the life he had lost. He picked up the letters. They were addressed to a Private Thomas Flynn of the 17th Mississippi Infantry, Barksdale's brigade, the very unit Silas had mentioned. The first letter was dated May 10, 1863, from a small town in Mississippi. It was signed simply, "Your devoted Eliza." Elias looked up at the vast, silent sycamore, then across the field toward the Sherfy house, now a quiet farmhouse. He was no longer on a ghost hunt. He was on a mission of historical, heartbreaking retrieval. He had to read the letters, and he had to find out how a Confederate soldier from Mississippi, carrying the secret of a woman named Eliza, had died at Gettysburg, clutching her empty locket, and why his beloved was still wandering the battlefield, waiting for a final word. Elias sat with his back against the rough, scarred bark of the sycamore. The sun had dipped low, painting the western sky in bruised purples and deep oranges, colors too beautiful for a place so steeped in death. He felt a profound sense of intrusion, handling the most private moments of two lost souls, a Confederate private and his devoted sweetheart. But the ghost's silent plea was louder than any sense of propriety. He began to read the letters, carefully unfolding the fragile foxed paper. The ink was faded, the handwriting an elegant, almost delicate script. The first letters were a chronicle of sweet devotion, filled with the mundane hopes of a young couple. Eliza described life back in Mississippi, the heat, the scarcity of goods, and her constant suffocating fear. Thomas, in his replies, which Elias had to infer from Eliza's responses, sent assurances, tales of camp life, and declarations of love. Then, the tone shifted. A letter dated June 20th, 1863, less than 2 weeks before the battle, stood out. "My dearest Thomas, your last letter left me terrified. I do not understand why the general has ordered you so far north, across the Grand River, and into the very heart of the enemy's country.
This feels too close to fate, my love, too desperate a throw of the dice. The journey has been terrible, Thomas, but I am here. I followed your instructions exactly. I am staying with a relative, a distant cousin in Harrisburg, a kind but nervous soul. She doesn't know why I came, only that I needed to see the North. But I know why. I had to be close to you. I have hidden the package as you instructed, near the great tree you described in your letter from Maryland, the one on the edge of the farmer's field, our sycamore. I could not bear to send it by post, for fear it would be taken or lost. When you come, when the fighting is done and you can slip away for even an hour, you must retrieve it. Remember, the locket is the key. I placed a tiny piece of ribbon inside it, the same color as the one binding these letters, so you would know. It contains everything. It contains our future. You must have it. You must find the strength to come back to me. Come back, or I will stay here until I find you. Forever yours and forever waiting. Eliza. Elias froze. He gripped the letter, the paper crinkling under his thumb. The ghost wasn't waiting for a word. She was waiting for a package. And the locket he carried, the one with the empty fold of paper, was supposed to contain a ribbon, the sign that the package had been secured. But his locket was empty, its contents perhaps lost in the chaos of battle. He quickly skimmed the final letters. They were frantic, desperate pleas to find her, dated July 4th, 5th, and 6th, written after the battle. Eliza was clearly nearby, unaware that Thomas lay dead less than 10 miles away. The final, heartbreaking note was simply a single sheet of paper addressed to any kind soul, tucked into the very bottom of the box. If you find this, please, I beg of you, I cannot find Thomas. They say he fell near the Sherfy house. He was carrying a small brass locket I gave him. If you have any honor or pity, if you know anything of the package he was meant to retrieve at the Sycamore, contact me. I am lost. I have nothing left.
Eliza Flynn, seeking the truth. P.S. The last known contact was with a Union hospital steward near Little Round Top. Elias felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. The pieces snapped into place with terrifying clarity. Thomas Flynn died near Little Round Top, clutching the empty locket. Elias found the locket there, taking it. Eliza came to Gettysburg, hid a package at the Sycamore, and then died, becoming the ghost. She haunts the fields because the package was never delivered, and Thomas never found the key, the ribbon in the locket. Eliza's final note mentioned a Union hospital steward near Little Round Top. Elias was recovering in a Union field hospital near Little Round Top when the haunting began. He was not just a passerby. He was the one who was meant to find this. He was the unintended recipient of her desperate plea. A gust of icy wind swept through the sycamore's branches, though the evening was otherwise calm. The light was almost gone. Elias looked up. Eliza stood before him, clearer now than she had been in his study, her translucent gray dress rippling like water. Her eyes, filled with centuries of unanswered grief, looked down at the cedar box in his hands. Her voice, the cold thought in his mind, was firmer now, less sorrowful and more commanding. You have it. The package is safe, but the locket is broken. The ribbon is gone. He never knew. He died without the promise. She gestured toward the box, her face etched with agony. The promise is broken. Only one man can fix it. The man who saw me fall. The man who carried my last hope. Who? Elias whispered, holding his breath. Who carried your last hope? The ghost pointed, not to the north, where he had come from, but to the south,
toward the jagged peaks of Little Round Top, veiled in the twilight. The general's aide. He took what was mine. He has the ribbon. Find him. Deliver it all. Only then can I rest. The cold retreated, and Eliza faded into the darkness beneath the sycamore. Elias was left alone, surrounded by the silence of the battlefield, clutching the tragic letters and the name of a new target, the general's aide. His mission had escalated from finding a hidden box to tracking down a high-ranking officer, perhaps across the entire reunited nation, all to deliver a tiny piece of blue ribbon and fulfill the promise of a Confederate ghost. Chapter 5. The General's Aide. Elias spent the early morning hours back in the boarding house, poring over the documents he had recovered. He couldn't shake the phrase, the general's aide. This was not an enlisted man or a minor officer. An aide to a general, especially during such a crucial battle, would be a member of the upper staff, a man of connection and means. Finding him wouldn't be simple. He reviewed his own wartime memories, focusing on the days immediately following the battle when he was recuperating near Little Round Top. The field hospitals were scenes of controlled chaos, a constant flow of the wounded from both sides. Union surgeons worked tirelessly, but there was also staff tasked with collecting and cataloging personal effects from the fallen, both Union and Confederate, before burial. An aide to a Union general, collecting effects. Elias needed a source of information beyond the whispers of the haunted fields. He knew exactly where to start: the Grand Army of the Republic. The Union Veterans Organization was a massive network, and their posts held meticulously kept records and, more importantly, the gossip and memories of countless former officers. Before leaving Gettysburg, he made one final, crucial stop. He rode out to Little Round Top itself. Climbing the steep, rocky slopes, the view was breathtaking and terrifying. He located the spot where he'd been wounded, the spot where the 20th Maine had famously defended the flank. It was here, down the slope, that he'd found Private Thomas Flynn. He stood silent for a moment, a veteran paying tribute to an enemy he now understood. Then he looked for the marker, the place where Flynn's temporary grave would have been. He found only the permanent markers of the Union dead. Confederate dead were often interred quickly or moved later to Southern cemeteries. He pulled out the cedar box and placed the portrait and letters inside again. He closed the locket, holding it tightly. Thomas, Eliza, I have the package. I'm going after the last piece. I'll finish this. Elias took the next available train to Washington, D.C. The capital, still reeling from Lincoln's assassination, was a hive of political maneuvering, reconstruction debates, and discharged soldiers looking for work. It was the perfect place to get lost and the best place to find information. He located the largest GAR post in the city, an imposing brick building near the Navy Yard. He presented his credentials, Captain, 69th Pennsylvania Infantry, and was ushered into the smoke-filled, boisterous main hall. He found a fellow officer, a grizzled major with a missing finger, named Horace Green. Elias introduced himself, shared a cheap cigar, and steered the conversation toward Gettysburg. "Major," Elias began, keeping his voice casual, "I'm helping settle some posthumous claims from my old regiment, trying to track down the movements of some general staff after the fighting died down, specifically the 2nd Corps side, near Little Round Top and the Peach Orchard." "Ah, the bloody angle," Green grunted, taking a deep drag. "What general are you interested in?" "Any general whose staff was tasked with gathering effects, particularly from the enemy dead, the afternoon of the 4th and the morning of the 5th of July. Anyone? No, that's an unusual order, but some generals were meticulous about respecting the dead. Major Green tapped his temple, thinking hard. Meticulous. That sounds like General Meade's headquarters staff, but they were too busy chasing Lee. No, wait. It was one of the division commanders. General Caldwell, maybe? Or even General Sykes. Pause. Then his eyes widened slightly in recognition. No, Captain Vance. It was General Warren, Governor Warren. He was the chief engineer, but he was everywhere on the battlefield. He had a reputation, and his senior aide, a young man sharp as a tack, very well connected socially, Lieutenant Alastair Thorne. Thorne was the one. His family, I hear, has a near obsession with history. He spent the entire 4th and 5th of July with a detail, cataloging effects. Strange work for an aide, but he was doing it. And I heard a rumor he took something of his own interest, a keepsake, they called it, from the fighting near the peach orchard. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. Lieutenant Alastair Thorne, the general's aide. Where is Lieutenant Thorne now, Major? Green laughed dryly. He's not a lieutenant anymore, Captain. The war is over. Thorne is back in New York City, running his family's import business. Rich as Croesus, that one. And he's already made a name for himself as an antiquarian, a collector of war memorabilia. He's known for having a private collection of Civil War relics that is none to one. Elias realized the true extent of the challenge. Thorne hadn't just accidentally taken a scrap of ribbon. He had collected it. He was a wealthy collector who likely viewed the blue ribbon not as a key to a tragedy, but as a priceless historical artifact.
Thank you, Major. You've been very helpful. Elias rose, the cigar now forgotten. The journey had just gotten longer, and the objective far more difficult. He wasn't dealing with a simple mistake. He was facing a privileged man who had unknowingly hoarded the peace of a wandering soul. He had to go to New York City and retrieve one tiny, faded piece of blue ribbon from a general's aide turned wealthy collector. New York City in the autumn of 1865 was a study in jarring contradictions. Below Canal Street, the financial district roared back to life with a ravenous energy, while uptown, the mansions of the Fifth Avenue elite stood as monuments to wealth untouched by the hardships of war. Elias, dressed in a civilian suit cobbled together from his few remaining funds, felt like a relic from another bloodier time. He located Alastair Thorne's residence through discreet inquiries at a few reputable gentlemen's clubs and banking houses. It was a massive brownstone fortress on a quiet street near Gramercy Park, a home built to showcase and protect inherited fortune. Elias learned more about Thorne. He was indeed an avid antiquarian, celebrated in society pages for his refined tastes and his extraordinary collection of Civil War artifacts. His passion was specifically for personal relics, items with a human story attached, which he displayed in a private study and occasionally showcased to fellow collectors. This confirmed Elias's fear. The ribbon was not merely misplaced, it was prized. The strategy of the relic. Elias knew he couldn't simply knock on the door and demand the ribbon. A former captain demanding a scrap of cloth from a wealthy lieutenant-turned-collector would be dismissed as a madman or a desperate beggar. He needed an entry point, a credible reason to see the collection. He found it in his own past. Elias's family, the Vances of Lancaster, were known in Pennsylvania business circles, and their mill had supplied textiles to the Union Army. He used this connection to secure a meeting with a minor but respectable member of the New York Historical Society. "I am assisting my family in compiling a history of textile supply during the war."
Elias explained to the society member, a Mr. Finch. "I heard that Mr. Thorne has an unparalleled collection of battlefield effects, particularly those of a personal nature. We are interested in seeing how soldiers personalized the cloth they carried, ribbons, patches, sentimental items, to include in our historical account." The ruse worked perfectly. Finch, flattered to broker access, arranged for Elias to be introduced to Thorne's social secretary and eventually secured an invitation for an afternoon visit. 2 days later, Elias found himself standing in Alistair Thorne's opulent parlor. Thorne himself was a man in his late 20s, impeccably dressed, with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that held a slightly unsettling glint of proprietary pride. "Captain Vance," Thorne said, extending a hand with a patronizing warmth, "a pleasure. I hear your family's contribution to the war effort was substantial, and you survived Gettysburg, a remarkable feat." "Thank you, Lieutenant Thorne," Elias replied, keeping his tone measured. "I understand your own service was unique, a concentration on the historical record, even amidst the fighting." Thorne smiled, accepting the compliment readily. "One must document history, Captain. Others focused on creating it. I preferred to preserve its residue. Come, let me show you my sanctuary." He led Elias into his private study. It was less a study than a museum of sorrow. Glass display cases lined the walls filled with grim treasures, spent bullets flattened on impact, pieces of shrapnel, tattered Union and Confederate flags, and countless personal effects, battered Bibles, broken spectacles, photographs of wives and children. Elias felt the air thicken, heavy with the weight of stolen memories. This was a man who collected death, sanitizing the horror into historical objects. He paused before a central, custom-made, velvet-lined case lit by a tiny gas lamp. "This, Captain Vance, is the heart of my collection. I call it the final attachments." The case held the most intensely personal items: a wedding ring, a lock of hair still tied with a thread, a small, dark, leather-bound prayer book pierced clean through by a mini-ball. "The war," he elaborated with academic detachment, "was a furnace that separated the essential from the trivial. These are the essentials, the things men carried to their graves." Elias scanned the case, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was looking for a single, faint piece of blue ribbon. He saw it. Nestled between a pair of brass shoulder boards and a tarnished cavalry button lay a small, dark cedar box, not the one he found, but another. Beside it, stretched taut against the red velvet, was a faded piece of blue satin ribbon, no longer than a finger. It was tied with a tiny, perfect bow. "That ribbon," Elias said, his voice completely level, pointing to the piece. "It's Confederate, I presume." Thorne chuckled. "Ah, the ribbon. An interesting piece. No, Captain, it has no military insignia, but the circumstances of its recovery are fascinating. It was found on the battlefield at Gettysburg, near Little Round Top, inside a simple brass locket clutched by a young soldier of Barksdale's brigade. A desperate, final token of love, wouldn't you say?" Thorne was describing Thomas Flynn's death scene perfectly. "And why the box next to it?" Elias asked, trying to keep his gaze casual. "That box," Thorne said dismissively, "is merely a container. It was found nearby, empty. I suspect the soldier was intended to meet someone there, perhaps an agent or an accomplice, but the contents of the box were never found. The ribbon, however, was the prize. It's the key to a lost secret, a final rendezvous that never happened, a profound historical mystery." Thorne saw a mystery. Elias saw a broken promise and a tormented soul. "I wonder, Lieutenant, If I might examine the ribbon more closely, for our textile history, we need to determine the weave and origin. It could be a southern domestic weave. Thorn hesitated, a flicker of suspicion crossing his eyes. He didn't like anyone touching his relics, but Elias's veteran status and the textile story lent him credibility. "Very well, Captain," Thorn conceded, pulling a small key from his waistcoat. He unlocked the case and carefully lifted the ribbon out with a pair of silver tongs. "But please, only look. Do not touch." As Thorn held the ribbon, Elias focused all his will. "Eliza, now!" The air in the room didn't suddenly get cold, nor did a phantom wail erupt. Instead, the gas light above the display case flickered violently, then settled down, casting a strange, elongated shadow on the velvet. Then, a sound so faint it could have been imagination, the whisper of a woman's sigh, like dry leaves skittering across stone, directly behind Thorn. Thorn stiffened, his eyes darting to the wall behind him. "Did you hear that, Captain?" "Hear what, Lieutenant?" Elias asked, calmly, his eyes never leaving the ribbon.
"A draft. A woman's sigh," Thorn muttered, visibly disturbed. He was a man of logic and history, but the battlefield air sometimes lingered, even in New York. The distraction was all Elias needed. With a sudden, swift motion, he didn't grab the ribbon, but the silver tongs. He didn't strike Thorn, he simply snapped the tongs shut, the pressure causing the decades-old fabric to shred into two pieces. Thorn gasped, his face draining of color. "My God! You ruined it! My artifact!" "No, Lieutenant," Elias said, his voice hard, dropping the broken tongs. He scooped up the larger piece of the ribbon and quickly tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. "I just fulfilled its purpose. This is not an artifact. It's a delivery." Thorn, enraged, lunged for the remaining piece. "You'll be arrested! Thief!" Elias blocked him with his wounded left arm, a movement that sent a sharp spike of pain through his shoulder, but gave him the necessary distance. "I was there, Lieutenant," Elias said, stepping toward the door. "I saw the boy who clutched the locket. He died for this, and I saw the ghost of the woman who was bound to this ribbon. You collected a history you didn't understand. I'm finishing a war you only watched." Elias turned and walked out, leaving the furious, sputtering collector standing alone in his silent museum of sorrow. He had the ribbon. The final piece was in place. He had to return to Gettysburg immediately, before Thorn could alert the authorities. The price of peace was now the threat of jail. Elias returned to Gettysburg with a relentless sense of urgency, the adrenaline from the confrontation with Thorn still thrumming beneath his skin. He avoided the main roads and took the winding country tracks, arriving back at the town under the cloak of a cold, moonless night. He knew he had to finish the task immediately. Thorn would undoubtedly contact the authorities, perhaps even accusing Elias of assault or theft of priceless property. He tethered his rented horse a good distance from the peach orchard, slipping through the darkness toward the ancient sycamore. The battlefield was utterly silent, the vast field seeming to hold their breath. The only sound was the rustle of dry leaves, or was it the silk of a spectral dress? He reached the base of the colossal tree. The air here was noticeably colder, carrying that familiar faint scent of lilies. He knelt by the shallow depression where he had found the cedar box. He pulled the box out again and opened it. Inside lay the miniature portrait of Eliza and the bundle of her tragic letters to Thomas.
Then from his inner coat pocket he carefully pulled the most volatile piece of the puzzle, the faded blue satin ribbon, now torn, its threadbare edges evidence of his desperate act in New York. He carefully placed the ribbon inside the box, letting it rest atop the letters, uniting the three elements of the broken promise: the message, the sycamore, inside the locket, the package, the letters and portrait, and the key, the blue ribbon. "Eliza," Elias called out, his voice a low, raw whisper that didn't dare break the stillness of the night. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A whirlwind of icy air erupted around the sycamore, so fierce it whipped the dry grass into a frenzy. The scent of lilies was now potent, almost suffocating. Elias shielded his eyes, bracing himself. She appeared not as a shimmering shadow, but with a clarity he hadn't witnessed before. Eliza Flynn stood before him, bathed in an internal faint blue light, her expression a mixture of profound shock and rising joy. Her eyes fixed on the open cedar box in his hand. "The ribbon. Thomas, you found the ribbon," the thought echoed in his mind, but this time there was a new quality to it, less sorrow, more wonder. Elias held the box out to her. "This is your future, Eliza, the future Thomas died trying to secure. I don't know what the package contains beyond the portrait and the letters, but here it is. The promise is delivered." She slowly reached out a translucent hand toward the box. As her fingers passed over the contents, the air around her stabilized. The ethereal blue light intensified, causing the letters and the ribbon to glow softly. Then she spoke, and the sound was not in her mind, but in the air, a beautiful, delicate soprano that had been denied its chance in life. "The package, Captain Vance. It was the money. All we had. Thomas was to sell his family land in Mississippi to finance a new life, a fresh start, far away from the war. We were going west. I brought the coin here, the life savings hidden beneath the portrait. He was to use the ribbon as the final proof that I had secured it safely." "But Thomas, the locket was empty when he died," Elias said, the old puzzle clicking into place. Eliza's face softened into unbearable tenderness. "He knew. He always knew I would find a way. When he found the cedar box, the ribbon must have slipped out and been lost in the confusion. He died clutching the empty locket, hoping that if someone found it, they would search for the final message. He died believing the money was safe for me."
The blue light around Eliza intensified, warming the air. She didn't look tormented anymore. She looked ready. "What happens now, Eliza?" Elias asked, gently closing the cedar box. She smiled, a peaceful, radiant expression that banished all the terror he had ever felt from her haunting. "The promise is fulfilled. The love is recognized. The journey is over." She began to fade, but before she was completely gone, she looked past Elias, across the fields, toward the silent ridge of Little Round Top. "Thank you, Captain Vance. Tell the world that even in the greatest war, some battles are fought for love, and some deaths are paid by strangers." The spectral blue light contracted, pulled inward as if by an invisible force, and vanished completely. The strong scent of lilies disappeared. The cold dissipated. The night air returned to its normal late autumn chill. Elias was alone, kneeling in the dirt beneath the sycamore. The silence was different now.
It wasn't the silence of waiting or sorrow. It was the silence of peace. The land, saturated with the history of violence, finally had one story that ended in resolution. He stood up, clutching the cedar box. His obligation was done, but the story was not. Elias did not go back to Lancaster immediately. He used the resources inside the cedar box, the money, which turned out to be a surprising cache of gold and silver coin, worth a significant sum even after the war, to trace Elias's distant cousin in Harrisburg. He used that connection to find the Confederate grave records. With tireless effort, Elias located the final resting place of Private Thomas Flynn in a segregated cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, where many of the Southern dead from Gettysburg were eventually interred. Elias Vance, the former Union captain, traveled south. He used a portion of the Flynn fortune to commission a beautiful, humble marker. He placed the cedar box with the portrait, the letters, and the fateful blue ribbon into the ground beneath the stone. The epitaph he chose was simple, drawing on the deepest truth he had learned on the haunted fields of Gettysburg. Private Thomas Flynn, CSA, 17th Mississippi Infantry, killed at Gettysburg, July 2, 1863. He kept the promise. At last, he rests with his love.